How does one do brutal honesty in a Winnie the Pooh sweatshirt? Like, look at this little guy, he just likes honey and good books. I feel like he likes honey and good books. So he'll be happy with at least half of this list. The other half of this list can get dumped in one of those pits for the heffalumps and woozles. I feel like there's some sort of existential metaphor in there for bad books being heffalumps and woozles. But honestly, looking for that metaphor would mean that I would have to give them more brain space, and they've already had quite enough. More than enough in some cases. And welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be my tops and bottoms, and it's kind of a special bumper edition because I didn't do one in October, owing to the fact that I read very few things in October, and although some of them were very good, they weren't worth an entire video all on their own. If you are new here, tops and bottoms is the way that I wrap up my reading month by talking about only my bestest of the best books and the books that belong in the other place, the bad place. And not the bad place that has, you know, Michael being adorable in it, but the pulping place. The place where bad books go to die. And for this video I have kind of an even split. I have 4 books that I really loved. 4 books that I really didn't. And one of those books is in fact responsible for putting me in the biggest slump that I've had in months. As in, like, it ruined all of spooky October for me, and I will possibly never forgive it for that. And seeing as how I have already brought up that terror of all of my Halloween joy, let's just talk about it. I'm a scooch. This is The Library of the Unwritten by A.J. Hackworth, and it is a book that has sat on my shelf for maybe a year, maybe a little bit more than that, just waiting for the perfect time, because it was, you see my friends, a rainy day book. I was so convinced I was going to love the contents of this book that I kept putting it off and putting it off. And I need you to also know that this book is actually the first in a series. I don't know if it's a trilogy or if it's going to be longer than that. I don't care anymore. My point being, I was willing to add another series to my series tracker spreadsheet, which I am diligently trying to get down before the end of the year, just to read this book in October. And oh boy, was that a bad idea. I don't know how to accurately and proportionately describe the levels of my disappointment in this book. Essentially, the premise of this is that we are following Claire, who is a librarian in Hill's Library. And Hill's Library is not like any other library. It is in fact where unwritten books go to be kept, question mark, or more accurately, unwritten and unfinished books. And it is Claire's job, along with her assistant, to categorise these books, to look after them and mend them, and to stop them from escaping, because occasionally a book will get an idea about the fact that it hasn't been written and a hero will escape, which is actually the premise of this one. A hero escapes and makes it back into the mortal realm, and it's Claire's job to make sure that it doesn't cause havoc. Now initially, in the first like 20-30 pages of this, I was actually really enjoying it. The descriptions of Hill and the way that Hill's library worked were really working for me. I really loved Claire's assistant, and the idea that Hill runs essentially kind of like a government department felt like very Terry Pratchett or Tom Holt-esque, both places that I'm happy to spend a lot of time. But unfortunately, the thing that let this one down was twofold. First of all, the writing. Now, my buddy read this with my lovely friend Kirsty, who is my co-host of Around the Disc in 800 Days, and she also was like, I should like this. Parts of me wants to like this more. But it is just, in her words, aggressively fine. And that really just hit the nail on the head for me. The writing in this is just aggressively fine. There are a few genuinely funny lines, there are a few absolute gems, and the rest of it is just like, meh. I was holding in there for the setting, because like I said, it is kind of like a government department, except that the library kind of exists adjacent to that, still under Satan's control, but Claire gets away with a lot of things that other departments would not, including being not that kind when she talks about Satan, which really freaks out the other main character in this series, who was just a little bit of a wet blanket, and who I didn't really care about hearing any more from, and was then very sad to find out he got a point of view. But the thing that really let this one down for me was Claire herself, and I did mention in my October reading vlog when I DNF'd this one that The writing in this reminds me of a 90s urban fantasy heroine. I'm talking things like the Anita Blake books here, where the main character is just too cool for school. She's very over everything, she's very blasé about stuff, she's very hard-nosed, and there's nothing penetrating its way through that. In short, she kind of felt caught between a like Mary Poppins figure who had no warmth about her at all, and that brand of teenager who is so aggressively over you and over life that you want to kind of take their pulse to make sure they're still alive. But this is one of those books that has sat on my bookshelf for such a long time, and that I had such high hopes for both the writing of and also the setting of, and I was just so disappointed in that it put me in a slump. Like, I couldn't make myself DNF it because I'd been looking forward to it so much, and that's not really on the book, that's on me. And again, that's something that I've discovered this year, this like tendency to hang on to rainy day books, that I'm going to be addressing in 2024 with my new bingo board. There is a square on it which is just going to try and tackle this problem head on. But yeah, my expectations were just so high, and I was let down so badly that I was like, surely it's going to get better. But then Kirsty, being the reading machine that she is, did finish this one, and she was like, no, in fact it does not get better. It stays aggressively fine all the way through. And I finally found it in me to DNF it, and as soon as I did that I was like, oh my god, this is the reason I was in a slump. This book is the reason I didn't read very much in October, and that hasn't happened to me in a long time. That's a phenomenon that I'm like really keenly aware of and I'm quite snappy in fixing, but it slipped through the cracks and it ruined things. So this one can literally go to hell. Yeah. Next up though, let's talk about another book that I was highly anticipating and that I did in fact finish in that reading vlog. One of the books that kind of saved October for me after everything, and that is The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher. You guys know that I am a massive T. Kingfisher stan. I read The Twisted Ones and I became a complete convert, and I have since been working my way through T. Kingfisher's back catalogue, but there are a lot of different branches to that back catalogue. But The Hollow Places was a perfect fit for my Spookopolython TBR, and it was the only one of her contemporary horrors that I had left on my shelves that I hadn't finished. The Hollow Places is about Carrot. She is recently divorced, very bitter about it, and kind of wallowing in her self-pity by reading fan fiction and spending what little money she's got left on takeaways, a mood that we can all relate to, when she realises that she is facing the very real and horrifying possibility of having to move back in with her mother because she is broke, and that is something in her late 30s that she does not want to do. And so when her absolutely adorable sweet baby angel of an uncle invites her to come and live and work at his museum, which is a museum of curiosities which has both like old taxidermy and portraits of Jesus made with sunflowers and other various weird artifacts like skulls, she jumps at the chance. But then when she gets there and is finally left alone in the museum, she discovers a corridor right at the back of it which cannot possibly exist on the plans of the place and leads her to a very, very weird environment. And predictably, I absolutely loved this. Regardless of the setting, and the setting I'll get to in a second, but regardless of any of T. Kingfisher's settings, it is her characters for me which absolutely lift the book off the page. Carrot is somebody that I could completely relate to. We are roughly the same age, we like roughly the same things, and we have roughly the same concerns about our life. And sometimes when I read contemporary fiction of any sort, I feel kind of like a barrier between myself and the character, especially if it's more on the literary side, where I'm like, I don't know about you, but I'm not philosophizing about what happens in 10 years or what I will leave behind or whatever. I am thinking about my most recent favourite piece of fan fiction, and I'm also realising that I haven't drank water all day, and I'm simultaneously feeling guilty for not being the best pet mum that I can possibly be. She talks in the same kind of sarcastic, tongue-in-cheek volleying banter that myself and my friends do, and she just warmed my heart so much. Almost as much as Mouse did in The Twisted Ones, but just not quite. She wasn't quite there, and that was because she made quite a few stupid decisions in this book, which is interesting because there are also some stupid decisions in The Library of the Unwritten, but I believed them less. Whereas Carrot's really stupid decisions, I was like, yeah, I can totally see one of my friends doing that in the midst of a crisis. I can absolutely see why under pressure you did not think of all of these eventualities. And so the really dumb things that she does are really, really believable. Now, as I say, T. Kingfisher's characters are the things that really sell her books to me, but I also really do like the way that she writes suspense. I love the building dread, and there is always building dread, because in the back of your mind, even though you're rationalising, oh, this isn't actually too bad, maybe if they do X, it'll be okay, you also kind of know that there's stuff just around the corner, sometimes quite literally, and that you're keeping yourself calm with that same kind of it'll be fine, it'll be okay, everybody's gonna be fine thing that the characters are using. Like, you're invested with them as if you're there with them. But that just means that the horror actually kind of infects your bones too. And I read the second half of The Hollow Places like this, like, oh my god, please no, damn it, I don't want it. Which makes me really happy, because there's not a lot in horror right now that's making me truly horrified. And that's why I'm so surprised that despite the fact that this is T. Kingfisher and so I was predisposed to like some parts of it, I actually liked all of it, because the plot of this one is very, very speculative. I like supernatural horror, I like ominous horror, I like horror where you're like, is that something that exists, or is this people that are doing this? Like, I like the question mark part of it, and this is very much not a question mark part of it. This is a certain something exists and that thing is horrible. And usually that doesn't do it for me, but it really, really did it for me. Like, it did it for me a lot. And again, didn't quite keep me up the way that the twisted ones kept me up, but it definitely did keep me looking around corners. So yes, another T. Kingfisher win under my belt. A horror that was not a win in October was the first book that I picked up for my Spookoplathon TBR, and that is The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig. Chuck Wendig is fairly prolific, and when I picked this up I was like, I can't believe that this is my first Chuck Wendig. Like, it's taken me a long time to get here, and he tends to write the types of horror plots that I like, so I'm not entirely sure why. And now I'm like, do you know what, maybe that was slightly serendipity. Maybe the reason that it took me a while to get here was because there was a lot of my brain that knew that this was inevitably not going to be for me. This one is supposed to be about a pair of people who grew up in this small town and ran very far away from it. Both of them came from really horrific backgrounds and things were just terrible, and they vowed never to go back there. Then they meet and get married as adults and have a child and are like, well, actually we don't have any roots anywhere else, so let's go back there and try and kind of rewrite the generational traumas that we went through and also address some of our baggage. And for all of those reasons I was in. I was like, that sounds great. I really love watching generational trauma get solved or healed down the generations, especially in something like a horror book where you don't expect to see that. And I was fully up for what on the back of the book was described as like a creepy kid befriending their small child. But not only was that premise kind of very misrepresentative of what actually happens, because they don't just decide to go back to heal generational trauma, they instead get handed like a huge house and a chunk of land when the husband's father dies. But also, these aren't really creepy little children, they are more creepy teenagers, one of whom has just made a bunch of crappy choices in his life and so was kind of like predisposed to have something latch onto him. So not only was I kind of catfished by the synopsis, which is something that annoys me a lot, but also when I did get into this one, the writing was so aggressively masculine, so very much in your face with the male gaze, that I was like, wow, I can really tell what you value as a person, sir, and I'm not jiving with it. The first 10 pages of this are an extremely graphic representation of a serial killer being taken to the electric chair and making it very clear that the guards there didn't know that there were extra numbers in that. And he was very kind of like vocally, cheerfully, almost pleasuring himself mentally with this as he was strapped to the chair. Like, it was a lot for the first 10 pages. And then after those first 10 pages, we then got more pages with graphic hunting scenes. And then some body horror that, while I acknowledge is not really where I live in the horror genre, like I can give or take body horror, but there was just something about the way that this body horror was written that gave me the grue. And so perhaps it was fate that intervened when, while hoovering the living room, Harry, with his posterior, dropped this book into the dog bowl, like the water bowl, and it got very waterlogged. He drowned this book. And you know, it was a sign. Never has a sign been more signy. Since DNFing it, I have heard so many other disturbing things about this book from multiple other people I'm just really glad that I left it where it was. Because when I say that I like disturbing horror, that kind of representation of the male gaze is not what I'm talking about. Although, while we're talking about representations of the male gaze, can we just talk about Penance by Eliza Clark and all of the numerous many things that it did right? Because we cannot talk about the tops of my reading for the last couple of months without talking in great detail about this one. This book utterly blew my mind. It took preconceptions that I had both about the true crime genre and about the thriller genre, and it just tore them into tiny little pieces and threw them like confetti, and it left me picking them up off the ground like, oh, I thought I knew things. I don't know any things. I don't know any of the things. So weirdly, Penance is the fourth of a group of books that I have read recently, which all kind of take the idea of investigating true crime and fictionalise it in a different way. There was The Mysterious Case of the Alperton Angels by Janice Hallett, which is about two journalists who are writing about true crime cases but have been commissioned to do so, and like the ethics behind that. There was None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell, which is about a podcaster who doesn't look into true crime at all, but who starts looking into a case for just like a really short stint of episodes, and then she gets dragged into her own true crime case in her own life. Then we had I Have Some Questions For You by Rebecca Mackay that I won't really talk about very much here because it's going to be in the next bottom section. And then there is Penance by Eliza Clark, and the premise of this is that this book that you are reading is a true crime book which exists, but it was pulled from shelves some years ago by publishers because there was controversy over where the journalist who wrote this true crime case got some of his sources. Now that the court case is finished, the publisher has reissued it with like an updated author's note and an interview at the end with the author, which you know the entire book is coming, but when it hits, it's still like so shocking. And this true crime book looks at a group of 3 teenagers who were all separately arrested for the murder of another teenager in their group. It's set in a small seaside town, and they are alleged to have locked this girl in a beach hut and set the beach hut alight. And we very much start at the beginning of this book by having a very clear assumption of these girls and what they are like, because the book opens up in kind of true crime fashion, because it starts by being like, yeah, these girls did that, and then they drove along the motorway, had a nap, and then took themselves to McDonald's, where they can be seen on CCTV having a laugh and a joke. And because of the way this book starts, I didn't really know what to expect. I hadn't read anything by Eliza Clark before, and I was reading this and listening to the audiobook of it, which was really interesting because it was kind of like listening to a narrated true crime book or a podcast. And it's so cleverly done, because each of these teenagers gets a full investigation into their backstory, but then the last teenager to be investigated is the one who died. And with each teenager, you think you understand how the puzzle pieces fit together. You think when you listen to their life and then their narration of their life in some cases, that you understand how this could have come about. But then another story is placed on top of that, and it kind of like turns a cog and changes some of the perceptions you had about the layer below it, and it just keeps doing that all the way until the end. And then when you get to the end, when you get through all 4 of these teenagers' story and you're like, oh my god, this was so complex, there was so much in here, so many things happen, I was led the wrong way so many times, you then get the interview with the author of the book, which completely flips the whole thing on its head. And I was just captivated, because in the times where you're forgetting that this is fictional, everything in here is so well researched, backed up by science, backed up by actual sources that can be cited, and it's just so smart. It is just so smart. And like all of the other books out of this 4, it does a lot of discussion of the kind of like ethics behind true crime, the ethics behind looking at one person and not seeing them complexly but seeing only what they've done, but being the person to write that and portray that story, and why are you the right person to do that, and also your point of view can't be entirely objective. It was just so cool. It was so cool. It was so well done. I loved it so freaking much, and I am absolutely going to pick up everything that Eliza Clark writes now, whether it's a thriller or not, because this was so good. Yes, right, so back to the not so good. Out of the 4 books that I mentioned there, I also said that I read I Have Some Questions For You by Rebecca Mackay. You guys might remember that when I picked this one up, when I hauled it initially, I said that I had tried Rebecca Mackay's last book, which is The Great Believers, which is essentially a slice of life literary fiction book about the AIDS crisis, and I hated it. I hated some of the attitudes in it. I hated its unrelenting bleakness, but I absolutely loved the writing. I loved the way that Rebecca Mackay turned a phrase. I loved the way that she like connected concepts together. So I was like, whatever she brings out next, I will give that a go. Maybe the fact that it is an unrelentingly bleak thing has to do with the subject of the book. I mean, I personally don't agree that any book about the AIDS crisis should only be bleak and not feature any kind of joy. The erasure of queer joy is just as present in AIDS narratives as it is anywhere else. But anyway, I was thrilled, no pun intended, to discover that the next book that she brought out was this one, because the premise was perfect for me. So I Have Some Questions About You is about Bodie Kane. She is a fairly famous podcaster who has looked into a bunch of true crime cases, and she's done really well for herself. So she has been invited back by her very small, very selective boarding high school that she went to as a kid to teach a semester on podcasting to the kids. And you would think that after what happened to her when she was there, she wouldn't want to go back, but she actually finds herself jumping at the chance, and she's like, oh, maybe the reason that I'm doing this is because I have unresolved issues when it comes to what happened to me there. Because what happened to her was that her roommate was murdered, and she's never really been able to get that spectre of her roommate out of her head. And initially I did love it, especially because when you lift like the top of the paint tin, the swirls that are underneath of Bodie's life are actually not as smooth sailing as you would think that they are. She's in the middle of a divorce, she's had to pause making episodes of the podcast. You know, like there's a lot of different tangled things in her life, so she's not a perfect person to go back and solve this. And I loved that about it, and I also loved the fact that even though she was going back and she wanted to investigate this, she had absolutely no idea how this was going to happen. And what she ended up doing was like dropping a little nugget into her podcast class about what had happened and about the fact that she was there for it, and it was her roommate, hoping that one of the kids in her class would get obsessed with it and want to do an episode on it. And I quite liked the fact that in her head she was justifying that as not being manipulative, but it really flagrantly was very unethical and stuff, but she wanted the answers. Like, I liked the grey morality of all of that. But unfortunately, I did not like a bunch of other things about this book. Like, for example, and this is a minor spoiler, so skip a minute along if you don't want to hear this, the only queer character who is openly queer on the page begins with having a really happy, stable home life and kids and stuff, and gets killed off in a really horrific, off-the-page illness way. Most of this book takes place during the investigation of this crime, and then suddenly the last quarter of this book takes place many years after, when they're trying to undo the conviction, and this character is just killed off the page like that. Just dealt with like that, gone. Like they didn't mean anything for the entire rest of this book, even though they were supposed to be Bodhi's best friend. It was horrific. There is also in here something that is meant to be a very profound discussion, wherein her ex-husband is accused, in the wake of the Me Too movement, of having taken advantage of a girl who was his publicist and assistant at the time. And Bodhi is so completely and utterly on her ex-husband's side in this, like 100% on his side, until she discovers that this is affecting her reputation and her podcast, and until she then discovers that this woman is actually black. Then she starts to get all these doubts in her head, and to unpick all of this like absolutely stringently on his side stuff, and it gave me the absolute ick. Like, I could see what Rebecca Mackay was trying to do. She was trying to be like, this is a complex situation, there are many different facets of this. The Me Too movement can be complicated for the spouses of people who are convicted, but it was so gross and so poorly managed that I think it's possible that the author didn't really realise the irony, that while she was trying to make this point about about her main character, she actually inadvertently made it about herself and the fact that she wrote that into this book. Then there was the rampant 90s description of bodies. The main character was not popular at all in high school, and she's in her what I think is early 40s at the beginning of this book, and as an adult she is still holding herself to the standards that she did when she was a teenager and not thinking that there's anything wrong with that. So she is still doing that thing where she's looking at other women and kind of being like, well, at least I don't look like her. There's a couple of times where she's like, well, at least I'm thin enough to still get away with this. There are a couple of times where eating disorders are blatantly glamorized. And then there is a line later on which was my deal breaker, which was my I can go no further with this, where she was talking about being unpopular, not being attractive, not feeling thin enough, and a boy, when they're leaving for the year, approaches her and her friend and is like, can I take your picture, you know, for like yearbook memories or whatever, and she's like, sure. And when he takes the picture, his male friend, who has his arms around Bodhi, and her female friend squeezes her female friend's breast. So it's a blatant sexual assault, and she's making this point about how this is horrific and how this was just something that happened and it was brushed off and how nobody, you know, really worried about it. How her friend later on got cancer in that breast, and she knows that somehow this horrible touch from this boy was the thing that put it in her. She even asks her friend's partner on the phone when she hears that she's got breast cancer, like, which breast is it in? Where exactly is it? Because she believes that this person's touch did that. And I was like, I am out. This had so much potential, and for the first half I was so very invested, but it just went some really horrific places, like some really truly horrific places, and they were not the horrific places that the author wanted us to think. So I think it's safe to say that this was my second and last try with Rebecca Mackay's books. Next up, just as a little palette cleanser, let's talk about a top that has been a top before. A top that reigns supreme and forever will be on this list anytime I reread it. And that book is The Dry by Jane Harper. I am rereading the Dry series with my Patreon book club, the Seance Society. This is our first series read along. We picked something short to start with, and I have read both The Dry and Force of Nature, which are books 1 and 2 in the Aaron Falk series, but I have not read Exiles, which is the last one. I picked it up and started it for a buddy read earlier on in the year, and I just never got through it. Again, because I do that thing where I'm like, this is a favourite series, this is the last book in this favourite series, I don't want it to end, and I got the fear. So I'm really glad that my patrons picked it for their series read along. There's a much better chance I am going to finish this series with the backup of them. Either way, October was when we started, so October, November, December is when we're going to read this series, and I absolutely adored this once again. It is possibly my favourite thriller series that exists. Jane Harper's also responsible for the standalone The Lost Man, which is my favourite thriller of all time. If you want to see my list of favourite thrillers of all time, you can watch this video here. And The Dry was where I started with her. The Dry was the first book that I read and the first thing that got me absolutely obsessed. Jane Harper is an Australian author, and I will say that there's just something in Australian fiction that works for me. I don't know whether it is a tone, I don't know whether it's a particular turn of phrase. Almost every book that I have read by an Australian author has ended up being a top on my list. So The Dry is about Aaron Falk. He is a fraud investigator, but he is not actually on the job at the beginning of this book. He is in fact going back to his very small town, which he absolutely does not want to go back to because he took great pains to run away from when he was in his teens, for a funeral of one of his childhood friends. Luke's funeral is not just a normal straightforward funeral, however it is a funeral for Luke, his wife and his children, because Luke is accused of killing them and then killing himself. Really, Aaron can't believe that his childhood friend would have done something like this. It's not the person that he remembers, but he also acknowledges that time does weird things to you, and so when he goes back there, he goes back with only the intention of just like paying his respects and leaving. But Luke's family get hold of him and are like, please, you are a police officer, nobody is listening to us, we don't believe that Luke did this, can you investigate it? And then he gets sort of caught up into that. And honestly, the atmosphere of this book, all of Jane Harper's books are set in different places in Australia, and each one of them really kind of evokes the atmosphere of the place that it is set in. And this one is a very small, very rural town that is frequently affected by droughts, hence the name The Dry, and therefore also frequently affected by wildfires. It is such an oppressive place. Everybody knows everybody, but everybody's kind of reliant on somebody else for something that they need out there. These families have been in this area, in this small town, for their entire lives. Lots of them, like Luke, never ever leave. And so Aaron has got all of those attitudes that he's trying to wade through, all of the judgments that have already been made on Luke and also on him when he was there as a child, because there are things that you don't know about Aaron and what he and Luke did when they were younger that are like repercussions throughout this whole series. Honestly, it's just so freaking good. I love Aaron Falk. He's, again, one of those main characters that I've accidentally fallen in love with. I am predominantly somebody who likes a side character or a secondary character. I'm not usually somebody who loves the main character very much. But Aaron Falk is, he's a sweet broken baby angel and he needs protected at all costs. There's a weird kind of certainty in this one that you're riding towards a conclusion that Aaron can't stop, that there's like a boulder rolling down the hill, and each time Aaron uncovers something to do with Luke's case, it also kind of triggers him to remember something about what went on when they were kids. And so we've got a kind of dual timeline, which you also know really works for me. So yeah, I was delighted to be able to reread this one. It was just so freaking good. And now this month we're reading Force of Nature, which actually kept me up quite a bit at night when I read it the first time around, so that's fun for me. And then finally for my bottoms we have another DNF, and one that took me kind of by surprise. This is This Family by Kate Sawyer, and actually the surprise might have been that I bought this in the first place, but there is a backstory to it. Much like Rebecca Mackay, this is the second book that I've tried from Kate Sawyer. The other one, The Stranding, I think that's the title, I don't know. The premise of this one triggered me so much that within the first 40 pages I was like, nope, I am out, I can't do this anymore. And I unhauled it, but again, much like Rebecca Mackay, I absolutely loved the writing in it. I loved the way that Kate Sawyer kind of wrote a scene from a very top-down point of view. I felt like I was being held at arm's length from the characters, but in a way that I was really enjoying. It was a very interesting way of storytelling, and so when I saw This Family I was like, oh my god, right, good. Here is a premise that I really love, and also we can try Kate Sawyer's writing again. So the premise of this one is that it is the marriage of the matriarch of this family, and that for this one day in her very extensive, very beautiful back garden, all of her family are to come together to celebrate her getting married. And this is a family that is like 40 years in the making. It has tons of secrets, it has tons of complicated family relationships, it has tons of people not quite liking each other or liking each other a little bit too much. And so asking all of these people to be in the one place for this length of time is actually going to be way more complicated than it sounds on the surface. And I love that kind of slice of life complicated family thing. It's the only thing that I really go into literary fiction for these days, and so I was like, okay, sign me up. And it started out great. Like, it started out so brilliantly. Again, we're in a summer heat wave in this one, and it's affecting everybody who's trying to like set up in this garden for the wedding. They've dragged all of the tables and chairs and stuff out of the house and covered everything with tablecloths. It's a little bit of a mishmash. You can feel the joy in it, you can feel the anticipation in it, and I really loved that. I also loved that the house was kind of like a character in this as well. It had been through so much with them. And the dual timeline in this one pops back to when the house was actually being bought in the first place, when the main character, who is now, you know, on her I don't know, I think this was like third marriage by this point, where she was pregnant and in her first marriage and full of hopes and dreams. And you follow those two timelines all the way through, from the present day where things are complicated to the past where things are getting complicated, and all of that was really, really interesting. I was so invested, and the writing was great. Again, it's that same kind of like top-down view of the characters where you're getting very high-level descriptions of everything that's going on, but you're getting a lot of dialogue in it, and so you're kind of having to interpret what's going on for yourself, and I really enjoyed that. But then kind of like 2/3 of the way through this one, it just really abruptly lost me. It started to get very confusing to understand. The past timeline was getting so sort of experimental in the way that it was told that I was actually not sure what was happening, and there were some very highly overwritten, overly detailed scenes which were about these tiny little minute incidents, and it was a very odd stylistic choice. Like, there's an incident where she's walking through the village and there's a pig farm, like a slaughter pig farm in the village, and a pig has got loose and it runs past her and it knocks her over, and she's picked up by some youths on the street who she had previously judged, and they walk her home. And although that might have like tied into something later on in the novel, the way that it was written and the kind of like oddness of that scene, and amongst all these other little family interactions and really tightly written lines of dialogue, kind of felt a little bit surrealist. It was a little bit dreamlike, and it just didn't work for me. I started to get confused about what was going on and who was talking to who and why I should care about any of these scenes, and I was just like, no, I don't, I'm done now, I'm out. So unfortunately this is another miss for me, and I won't be picking up any other books by Kate Sawyer either, which is really sad. But I guess you win some, you lose some, and when it comes to literary fiction, my win-lose record ain't that great these days. But then finally we are leaving on a high note. We are leaving on a top that I have not stopped talking about, and it would be fair if you guys were like, ah, here she goes again. But I don't think until I'm finished with this series that I am going to stop talking about it, that you are going to stop hearing about it. And I'm both sorry and really not sorry for that, because I love it so much. So the last top on my list is Morningstar by Pierce Brown. This is the third and final book in the original Red Rising trilogy, which is now like an expanded series. We now have 4 planned books after it, 3 of which have been published. And I have started reading, as of me filming this, Iron Gold, which I am terrified about, because Iron Gold is set many years after this trilogy, and it is in fact the first multi-POV book in the series, because the first 3 we are only getting Darrow's point of view, and I have a lot of fears. I have a lot of fears. So again, if you haven't heard me talking about this series and you don't know anything about it, this series is about Darrow. He is a red, which is the lowest caste in the colour caste system in this world. He is a miner under the surface of Mars. His people have been for generations. They are mining for a precious substance called helium-3, which will be used to terraform the surface of Mars in order to move the dying people from the dying Earth over, so that they can, you know, save the race. Darrow's life, the life of his family and everybody around him, is truly horrific. It's bleak, it's short, but they know that what they're doing, that this mining is needed, that they're sacrificing for a greater good. And then one day something also truly horrific happens to a member of Darrow's family, and he is taken to the surface of Mars by a mysterious person who shows him that the surface of Mars has been terraformed for a really long time. And the series is about him infiltrating the highest caste in this system in order to bring it down from the inside. Morningstar was everything, literally everything that I could ever have wanted from the end of this trilogy, and yet it contained so many things that I absolutely did not want. I aggressively did not want. The characters in this series are so affecting. They are so difficult not to fall in love with, because they are portrayed as complex and morally grey from the beginning. Not a single person in this entire series is 100% good or 100% bad. Nobody is portrayed as an absolute, and because of that, at the very beginning of this series, when Darrow enters the Institute and starts training to do this thing, and he makes all of these friends, because you get to see them then before they're real people, and the series very much follows them as they grow together, you are so emotionally invested in some of the choices that they make and the alliances that they make and the friendships that they have. There are friendships in these books which haven't been intact since the very first book that I'm still mourning. There are people in these books who have flipped sides where I'm like, no, please come back, please come back. There are so many characters who are no longer with us, who I am not okay about not being there anymore, who I am actually physically shook are not there anymore. It makes me so sad, you have no idea. Honestly, I'm not okay. This is another one of those series where you should not emotionally invest in anybody, and yet there's no way not to. And quite honestly, I do not remember the last time that I got this invested about a series. Like, I love this the way that I love Lockwood and Co. I love this the way that I love Realm of the Elderlings. I love this the way that I love Illuminae. Those series, those big pivotal series, are like so few and far between in my reading life. I think they are for everybody. We all have series that we really enjoy and that we're invested in, but not series that we would absolutely go to bat for, not series that we would line up at midnight to get the next release from. But this is that series for me. I just feel like I'm never gonna be the same again. So that's it, guys. That wraps up yet another tops and bottoms. As always, please tell me if you have read any of the books that I've talked about here today, if you agree with me or don't agree with me. We love opinions here. Leave those below in the comments. And based on the things that I've absolutely loved in this video, please feel free to leave me recommendations for more things that you think that I would love. If you have got this far through the video, then please leave me a kangaroo down below for the dry, because I promise that not all of the emojis that I ask you guys to leave me will be related to Red Rising. I'll give you a break for a couple of videos before I go back to spaceships and moons and stars. So yeah, if you've got this far through the video, leave me a kangaroo down below. If you've really enjoyed me telling you not only what I absolutely loved, but what I absolutely hated, and you would like more of that in the future, then please hit that subscribe button. And if you are a returning guest here and you really enjoyed this video, then please don't forget to hit that thumbs up. Likes really do help my channel. And I will speak to you guys really soon. Bye!